Somewhere in the Andes, an empire of 10 million people was destroyed in roughly 18 months by 168 Spaniards. Every history book frames this as a military story. Gold, ambush, betrayal, the audacity of Francisco Pizarro. But the conventional explanation has always had a problem at its core. 168 men cannot defeat 10 million. The numbers refuse to work. For centuries, historians filled the gap with theories about steel, horses, and surprise. I first came across the Inca question while researching something else entirely and could not let it go. Recent ancient DNA studies of Andean remains have rewritten the account completely. Something had already happened inside the Inca Empire before Pizarro ever set foot in Cajamarca. The genetic evidence is finally clear about what it was, and what the DNA revealed was not what anyone expected. Start with the scale of what was destroyed, because the scale is the first thing that makes the story refuse to make sense. The Inca Empire in early 1532 covered more than 2.5 million square kilometers, stretching along the spine of the Andes from what is now southern Colombia down to central Chile. Roughly 10 million people lived inside its borders. By every meaningful measure, it was the largest empire that ever existed in pre-Columbian America and one of the largest empires anywhere on Earth at the time. The infrastructure alone tells you what kind of civilization this was. A road network of more than 40,000 kilometers, much of it paved, crossing mountain passes that European engineers would not attempt for another 300 years. Storehouses positioned at calculated intervals along those roads kept stocked with grain, textiles, and weapons. A relay system of trained runners that could carry a message from Quito to Cusco, a distance of nearly 2,000 kilometers, in under a week. Stone masonry so precisely cut that you still cannot fit a knife blade between the joints today. The Inca rulers of the age had every structural reason to believe their civilization would continue to grow and prosper for centuries, possibly longer. Then, in roughly 18 months, all of it collapsed. The force that destroyed it numbered exactly 168 men. No reinforcements arrived during the critical period. No naval support, no second army landing on the coast. At the decisive engagement at Cajamarca, those 168 Spaniards faced an Inca force outnumbering them roughly 500 to 1. The traditional explanations are all real. The Spanish carried arquebuses, falconet cannons, steel armor, horses bred for war, and they executed an ambush so audacious that battle-hardened Spanish veterans reportedly wet themselves in terror beforehand. All of that genuinely mattered, but none of it is enough. A force of 168 men, however well armed, however bold, should have been overwhelmed by sheer mass within days. They were deep inside enemy territory, thousands of kilometers from any meaningful resupply, facing an empire with a standing army in the hundreds of thousands. Something else was already wrong inside the Inca Empire when Pizarro arrived, something the Spanish themselves did not understand and would not have been able to see if they had. The first clue did not come from the battlefield. It came from the bones of people who had died years before any Spaniard ever reached the Andes. The invasion that broke the Inca Empire arrived before the invaders did. It was not military, it was viral. Old world diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, had no parallel in the Andes. There had been no prior exposure, no generations of selective pressure thinning out the susceptible and leaving the resistant behind. Europeans had been living with these diseases for centuries, taking their losses, building the kind of population-level immunity that comes only from repeated exposure across many generations. Andean populations had none of that. When the pathogens crossed the ocean, they arrived in bodies that had no biological defense against them at all. Smallpox is thought to have reached South America by 1524. Pizarro did not arrive at Cajamarca until 1532. That gap, 8 years, is the part of the story most history books skip past. 8 years of an invisible enemy moving through the empire along the very road network the Inca had built to project their power, killing indiscriminately, leaving entire villages empty. What the ancient DNA work has added is forensic precision. Genetic studies of pre-contact and post-contact Andean remains show a sudden, dramatic collapse signature written into the genome itself. Population bottlenecks, loss of haplogroup diversity, demographic compression so severe it leaves a permanent mark on the genetic record of every population that descended from it. Some studies estimate that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Andes died in the century following contact. The first and largest wave of that die-off happened before Pizarro's army ever engaged an Inca soldier in battle. The human scale of this is almost impossible to absorb. Imagine an empire of 10 million people losing, conservatively, 2 or 3 million of its inhabitants in less than a decade, from a cause nobody understood and nothing could stop. Now imagine that the losses were not evenly distributed. They were concentrated in the densely populated administrative centers, in the cities where the empire's elite, its priests, its scribes, its generals lived and worked. The emperor himself was not exempt. Huayna Capac, who had ruled the Inca for nearly 35 years and brought the empire to its territorial peak, died of what was almost certainly smallpox in 1527. His designated heir, the son he had chosen to succeed him, died of the same disease just weeks later. The empire lost its leadership before the conqueror arrived. The throne was empty, and what happened next would prove far more destructive than the disease itself. What followed the death of Huayna Capac was the worst possible succession crisis in the worst possible historical moment. Inca succession had always been complicated. Emperors were polygamous on a scale that produced absurd numbers of potential claimants. Huayna Capac is estimated to have fathered around 250 children across his principal wife, lesser wives, and concubines. Most of those had no real claim to the throne, but enough did to make the question of succession genuinely open the moment both the emperor and his chosen heir were dead. Two candidates emerged. Huascar, born to Huayna Capac's principal wife, was backed by the established nobility in the capital at Cusco. Atahualpa, the son of a secondary wife, was backed by many of the empire's best generals and most of the standing army in the north. Both had legitimate enough claims. Neither was willing to step aside. The result was 3 years of full-scale civil war, beginning around 1529 and tearing through the empire until late 1532. The forensic detail matters here. The war fractured the nobility, killed many of the most experienced generals, and battered the standing army. Cities were sacked by Inca forces themselves. Tumbes, the wealthy coastal port the Spanish had heard about for years and finally reached in 1532, was found in ruins. Not destroyed by foreign invaders, destroyed by Inca soldiers during the Civil War. Then the genetic layer makes this even stranger. Ancient DNA work on burials from this period shows not just population loss, but the selective loss of specific lineages. Certain Y chromosome and mitochondrial haplogroups associated with the Inca elite, the priestly class, and the military aristocracy effectively disappear from the genetic record during these years. The Civil War did not simply kill people in proportion to the population. It surgically removed the leadership class whose descendants would have organized any coordinated resistance to what was coming. Atahualpa won. Huascar was captured and eventually executed on Atahualpa's orders. But the empire Atahualpa inherited was a husk of the one his father had ruled. The army was exhausted. The nobility was fractured between factions that had spent 3 years trying to destroy each other. Loyalties everywhere were divided, provisional, conditional. By the time Pizarro arrived in November 1532, Atahualpa had ruled the entire empire for less than 6 months. He was at Cajamarca to recover at the hot springs after finally defeating his brother. The empire Pizarro met was not the empire that had existed a decade earlier. It was, almost down to the month, the perfect moment to attack. What happened at Cajamarca on the 16th of November, 1532, was not a battle in any honest sense of the word. It was a slaughter that the Inca emperor did not realize was happening until it was already over. Atahualpa arrived in the central plaza, carried on a feather-covered litter by 80 of his most senior officials. He was surrounded by around 6,000 attendants. Most of them were unarmed. Priests, musicians, dancers, servants, nobles in ceremonial gold. He had left the bulk of his army, roughly 70,000 warriors, camped at the hot springs just outside the city. The meeting was meant to be diplomatic. The Spanish numbered 168. What followed lasted under 2 hours. 12 arquebuses, a handful of falconet cannons, 62 cavalry, and infantry in steel armor against a crowd that had never seen any of these things before. The Inca lost roughly 3,000 men. The Spanish lost one, an African slave, who likely was not supposed to be fighting at all. Pizarro made the decision that won him the empire in a single moment, blocking one of his own men from killing Atahualpa and taking the emperor alive instead. With the emperor captured, the 70,000 warriors outside the city had no command structure to coordinate around. They did not attack. They scattered. The traditional explanation stops there. Surprise, technology, audacity, all real. But it does not actually explain the scale of the collapse that followed. Empires do not fall because their leader is captured for an afternoon. The deeper answer is written into the bones. Recent archaeogenetic work on mass burial sites across the Andes from this period shows the demographic devastation was already so severe by 1532 that the surviving population was effectively in shock. DNA-derived population modeling suggests the effective breeding population in some regions had already dropped by more than half before Pizarro's army ever reached the highlands. The disease wave from the late 1520s, then 3 years of civil war on top of it, had compressed the empire into something far smaller and far more fragile than its nominal 10 million inhabitants suggested. The 70,000 warriors outside Cajamarca were not the empire's strength. They were its concentrated last reserves, mobilized by an emperor who had ruled for 6 months over a population that had just buried a significant fraction of its own people. The collapse was not caused by 168 men. The collapse had already happened. The Spanish only had to walk into what was left. The detail that finally rearranges the whole story is this. The conquest of the Inca Empire was carried out mostly by other indigenous people. The Siege of Cusco in 1536 and 1537 is remembered in most history books as Spanish against Inca. The numbers tell a very different story. Manco Inca, the emperor the Spanish had installed and then humiliated, raised an army of around 100,000 men and marched on the city to drive the Spanish out. The defending force was a couple of hundred Spanish soldiers and somewhere in the region of 30,000 indigenous warriors fighting alongside them. Do the arithmetic. Spaniards accounted for roughly 0.6% of the defending army and about 0.1% of all the combatants on the field. By any honest measure of who was actually fighting, the Siege of Cusco was another phase of an indigenous civil war. The reason these indigenous warriors fought for the Spanish is the part of the story the Inca rarely told themselves. Their empire had been built by conquest, and built fast. When Pizarro arrived in 1532, the empire was barely a century old. The vast majority of its territories had been absorbed within living memory. Forced resettlements, labor drafts, heavy tribute demands, the systematic dismantling of local elites. The conquered peoples remembered all of it. The Spanish, like Cortés in Mexico a decade earlier, positioned themselves as liberators. It worked. Then the genetic evidence makes this even harder to dismiss. Modern population genetics of the Andes shows that European Y chromosome contribution to the surviving indigenous population runs surprisingly low. The genetic record of the conquest era is overwhelmingly indigenous. What the Spanish achieved was not a demographic replacement. It was a political conquest layered on top of an indigenous demographic and military collapse that had already happened, accomplished by allying with the empire's internal enemies and using them as the actual instrument of war. The Inca did not lose to Europeans in any straightforward sense. They lost to a disease their bodies could not fight, to a civil war that had gutted their leadership, and to the resentment of populations their own empire had recently conquered and refused to assimilate. The 168 Spaniards at Cajamarca were the spark. The fuel had been accumulating for years. There is one more layer the DNA reveals, and it changes how we should think about what actually survived. Because the empire fell, but the people did not. The collapse was real. The depopulation was real. The political destruction of the Inca state, completed in 1572 with the public execution of Tupac Amaru in the central plaza of Cusco, was real. And yet what the DNA shows is that the genetic and cultural thread the empire had ruled over did not actually break. Modern population genetics of the Andes shows direct, unbroken ancestral continuity between living indigenous populations and the pre-contact Andean peoples. Studies of Quechua-speaking communities, particularly in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, show mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages that trace back through the conquest period and far beyond, deep into the millennia before any Inca emperor ever ruled. The European genetic contribution, when it appears, is layered on top of an indigenous foundation that remained substantially intact. The genetic detail goes further. High-altitude adaptations that evolved over thousands of years in Andean populations are still present in living people today. Distinctive hemoglobin variants that improve oxygen transport at altitude. Enlarged lung capacity. Cardiovascular adaptations that allow sustained physical exertion at elevations that would incapacitate a lowlander. These are not cultural choices. They are written into the genome itself, the product of millennia of selective pressure in environments above 3,000 meters. They survived the conquest because the people who carried them survived. The cultural evidence reinforces this at every level. Quechua, the imperial language of the Inca, is still spoken by between 8 to 10 million people across the Andes today. It is taught in schools. It is used in markets, in homes, in religious ceremonies. The stone foundations the Inca built still stand beneath the colonial palaces of Cusco because Spanish engineers could not figure out how to move them and eventually stopped trying. The festivals that fill the highland calendars blend Catholic saints with mountain spirits whose worship predates the Inca themselves by thousands of years. The Inca Empire as a political structure ended in 1572. The emperors were executed one by one until none remained. The administrative system was dismantled, the storehouses emptied, the road network repurposed. But the deeper thing the empire had organized, the genetic and cultural inheritance of the peoples who lived in the Andes, did not end with the empire. It is still there. When you meet a Quechua speaker in the highlands of Peru today, you are looking in a measurable biological sense at the continuous descendant of a population that has lived in those mountains for thousands of years. The empire fell. The thread did not. Here's the thing that stays with me after spending weeks inside this material. The story of the fall of the Inca is not really the story of 168 Spaniards doing the impossible. The DNA tells a different story. It tells of an empire that had already been hollowed out by an invisible enemy years before the visible one arrived. It tells of a civil war that surgically removed the leadership class that might have organized resistance. It tells of conquered peoples turning on their conquerors with reasons of their own. And it tells of something else, a genetic and cultural continuity that has outlasted the conquest itself by nearly 5 centuries and is still measurable in the blood of people living in the Andes today. The empire fell, the emperors were executed, but the deeper thread, the one written into the genome itself, never actually broke.